We are back. This is the Parsha podcast. My name is Yaakov Walby. I'm sitting in the Torch Center in Houston, Texas, and I'm very excited to dive deep with y'all into this week's Parsha, into Parshas Shelach. And I will give a periodic reminder, as I like to do, that if you are enjoying this podcast, it is quite likely that you'll enjoy some of my other shows. As you may or may not know, I am the proud and fortunate host of 6 different podcast shows, and you can actually find the links for all of them in the description of each one of the podcasts. So this is the Parsha podcast. We go through the Parsha each week. Now we're in year 8 of the Parsha podcast. But if you have yet to sample some of the other shows, there's never a better time than the summer to explore and to be a bit adventurous and to maybe try out some of the other shows. So the Parsha podcast, it's our favorite. I get that, but maybe try some of the other shows. You may find something very delightful and exciting and interesting for you to enjoy. And of course, if you have any questions, comments, or feedback, I always appreciate them. My email address is rabbiwalby@gmail.com. So once again, we have an incredibly action-packed Parsha Shelach. It begins with the nation under the impression that their entrance into the land is imminent. And Moshe sends 12 spies, 12 scouts to go on a reconnaissance mission. Go scout out the land of Israel, the land of Canaan, and report back with your findings. And these ostensibly righteous men, they reconnoiter the land for 40 days. And they return with a very scary and ominous report. And yes, they acknowledge that the land is flowing with milk and honey, but the people are strong and mighty and formidable, and the defenses are impregnable, and we won't be able to conquer it, they warn. And 2 of the spies, Joshua and Caleb, they argue, no, we of course will be able to conquer it. We have God on our side. We could carve up the Canaanites like they were helpless bread. But the nation, unfortunately, listens to the story of 10 of the 12 spies, and they sob, and they cry, and they wail, and they weep. And the Almighty is very disappointed with their lack of faith, and he threatens, I'm going to destroy the nation. We'll start off with you, just you, Moshe. And Moshe again intervenes, as he did with the sin of the golden calf. And the Almighty agrees to Moshe's intercession, but nevertheless, the people are punished. And for the 40-day journey that the spies undertook in the land, the nation is condemned to not enter the land of Canaan for 40 years. Only Joshua and Caleb will enter, but the entire adult population will die in the wilderness, be buried there, and their descendants will enter the land. In the aftermath of that, there were a small cohort of Jews that said, we're going to go nonetheless. But Moshe did not depart from the camp with them. He warned them against it. The ark remained in the camp, and unfortunately they were slaughtered. That's the beginning of the Parsha. It's the story of the spies, their report, and the aftermath. And then what follows is a curious string of laws and narratives. First, the nation is told that when they bring sacrifices, they should accompany the sacrifices with meal offerings and wine libations. And this seems a bit out of place, but Rashi and the Ramban tell us that this is a form of comfort. Even though they are condemned to linger in the wilderness for 40 years, this cherished prize that they were anticipating to enter the land and to conquer it, now they're losing it, but they're comforted by knowing that indeed the nation will enter. Then we read about the mitzvah of separating the challah dough and giving it to the Kohen. This is a sort of tithe. The first bunch of a dough is given to the Kohen. And then we read about the protocol for, by mistake, worshiping idols. What happens then? What are the sacrifices that an individual or the public offer in the event that they, by mistake, they worship idols? And then we have this very interesting story of the Mekoshesh. This is someone who was caught. Witnesses saw a person gathering twigs on Shabbos. And that, of course, is a violation of the laws of Shabbos. And he was seized, and he was ultimately executed for this crime of violating the Shabbos. And the Parsha ends with the third paragraph of the Shema, and that instructs us to place on four corners of our four-cornered garments, the tzitzis wrapped with a string of blue tchelis wool. That is the second part of the mitzvah, to remember the Almighty with this wonderful mitzvah of the tzitzis and the tchelis. Now, in this very special edition of the Parsha podcast, we have three wonderful segments. And of course, the theme of year 8 of the Parsha podcast is Dad. Because the Torah, of course, connects us not only to the Almighty, but it also connects us to our antecedents, to our father, to our grandfather, to our great-grandfather, to our great-grandparents, and all of our ancestors, going back to that glorious day where our nation was at the foot of the mountain at Sinai. It's important for us to realize not only does this enrich our own spiritual lives and connection with the Almighty, but also deepens our bond with our illustrious antecedents. So we go a bit deeper into this Parsha Shelach. Let's begin. I selected 3 different segments, and we start off with a warm-up segment. This is just, to loosen up a little bit. If you analyze the feedback that the spies offered regarding the land, one of the things that they say is that it's a land that consumes its inhabitants. They spoke negatively about the land, chapter 13, verse 32, and they said, Ha'aretz asher avarnu ba, the land that we traverse through, it's Eretz ocheles yoshvahi. It's a land that consumes, that eats up those who dwell in it. Now, what does this mean? So Rashi tells us, very interesting, when these 12 spies were entering the land, of course, it would be very unfortunate for them if they were noticed, if they were caught, if they were arrested. The spies, it's not a welcome thing to the homeland, of course. So if they were arrested, if they were noticed by the indigenous population, that would spell doom for them. So the Almighty created this artificial pandemic, and wherever they went, all they saw were funerals. The people were so preoccupied with the funerals of their loved ones, they didn't notice these 12 Jews who were walking around and looking around and inspecting the defenses and so on. And, of course, this was a gift from the Almighty. It was a divine distraction. The Almighty distracted the inhabitants in order that they would not notice and perhaps arrest those spies who were foreigners who were examining the land. But they misinterpreted it as the land consumes those who live in it. It's a land that people just die left, right, and center. Everyone's dying. It's not a safe land. It's not a hospitable land. Everyone's just dying. The land consumes those who inhabit it. So this is idea number 1. Rashi tells us that even though they might did them a favor, he was distracting the people that could have caused them trouble. They perceived it as being negative. So I think the lesson for us with this Rashi is that sometimes good news is perceived as bad news. And of course, we believe, the Talmud tells us, that everything that the Almighty does is for our benefit. So all bad news that we encounter, that we learn about, it's actually good news. Of course, it's sometimes hard for us to appreciate that. We have a very microscopic world view. We don't see the whole history in the big picture, but this is maybe an example of at least a lesson for us that the people, when they witnessed, everyone's just dying. There's just funerals everywhere. Funerals galore in the land of Canaan. It was actually for their benefit, but they misinterpreted it as being a negative attribute of the land. There are some other ideas about what maybe is a deeper interpretation or an alternative interpretation as to what it means that the land consumes those who inhabit it. Because even though these spies are wicked ultimately, and they're speaking negatively about the land, but it seems like what they said was actually true. the way they described the land was accurate. It was their commentary, their interpretation of what they learned. They said that it's unconquerable. That was their mistake. So when they described the land as the land consumes those who dwell in it, it was accurate. According to Rashi, it means that people were just dying, and that was, of course, not a negative quality about the land, but it was the Almighty intervening. But there's some other ideas as to what perhaps this may be hinting at. So listen to this. Idea number 1. The sources tell us when someone dies, the definition of death is the separation of body and soul. A human, when they're alive, they're a hybrid. They're a fusion. They are a chimera, where there's 2 parts within them, 2 elements, 2 competing identities within a single person, the body and the soul. And they are fused together. They are merged together. They are married together temporarily for their life in their lifetime. And when they die, when a person dies, well, each one of those parts goes back to their respective origin. So the body goes back to its origin, which is the dust of the earth. And the soul goes back to its origin, which is up in heaven on high. And of course, what happens to the soul is very much determined by how righteous the person was in their lifetime. But it's very desirous for the soul to find a resting spot in heaven. And the sages tell us that so long as the body has not fully assimilated back to its original state, i.e. as dust, so the body is decomposing, it's being eaten up, so to speak, by the ground, until that happens, the soul cannot find its, so to speak, resting spot in heaven. It's still in limbo to a certain extent. And therefore, it's a great benefit for a person after they pass for their body to decompose and to be absorbed and eaten up by the ground, the physical body, as quickly as possible, because that enables the soul in heaven on high to find its resting spot sooner. So the commentaries tell us a different alternative, a deeper interpretation into this verse, chapter 13, verse 32. Eretz ocheles yoshveh, it's a land that eats those who dwell in it. There's a quality in the land of Israel that it quickly consumes the bodies that are buried in it. It enables a person to swiftly shed their physicality, allow the body to be absorbed and integrated and assimilated into dust, and thereby facilitating that the soul in heaven finds its resting spot quicker. What an interesting idea. Maybe it's not so pleasant to think about. None of us like the thought of our body being gnawed at by the worms and the maggots and turning back into dust. That's an unpleasant thought for some of us to think about. But on a conceptual level, especially when we read the midrashic literature and the Kabbalistic literature that talk about the importance of the body going back to its source so that the soul can go back to its source, this is maybe hinted to in these words, the land of Israel. It's a desirous land to be buried in, and one of the reasons why perhaps is because it's an Eretz ocheles yoshveh. It's a land that very quickly eats up, chews up those who dwell in it, meaning the bodies. Idea number 1. The Hasidic masters say another idea. Eretz ocheles yoshveh, a land that consumes those who sit in it. Yoshveh means to sit or to dwell. Yoshev means to sit or to dwell. The Hasidic masters tell us that the land of Israel is intolerant to stagnation, to stasis. You want to sit? You want to remain wherever you are on the spiritual totem pole? The land of Israel is not for you. In the land of Israel, it's a place of rapid ascension or, unfortunately, rapid decline. And maybe this is part of the message that the spies are conveying to the nation. It's a Eretz ocheles yoshveh. It's a land that consumes those who try to sit in it, who try to remain stagnant in it. You want to go to the land of Israel, you have to understand what that demands of a person. It demands that they are not sitting. They're not stagnant. They are in a constant upward trajectory and they're not staying put. Okay, that's the warm-up segment. Very nice ideas, some deeper and alternative interpretations as to what the verse means and what the spies meant, the scouts meant when they said Eretz Ochel Yisrael, land that consumes its inhabitants. But I want to focus on the end of the Parsha. Chapter 15, from verses 32 to the end of the Parsha, we have 10 verses that address the final two subjects. Number one, we have the episode of the Mekoshesh, the person who was executed for violating the Shabbos by collecting twigs or wood. And the 5 final verses about the mitzvah of tzitzis. So it tells us the Jewish people were in the Midbar, they were in the wilderness, and they find a man who is gathering twigs on Shabbos, and they arrest him, and they bring him to Moshe, and they don't know what to do with him. They know that violation of Shabbos is a executable offense. It's a capital crime, but they don't know exactly how to process him. And they're told, the Almighty tells Moshe, this person must be executed by stoning, because they violated the Shabbos, and the proper way to treat them when it's done, when the crime is done with witnesses and warning and so on, all the criteria for capital crime have been met. It's time for the person to be executed, and indeed the person was executed. This is the second person who was executed for capital crime in the wilderness. The first was the blasphemer at the end of Parshas Emor in the book of Leviticus. The person is gathering wood on Shabbos, the witnesses warn him, they seize him, and the person is executed. That's the penultimate section of the Parsha. And the 5 final verses, very famous verses, this is the third and final paragraph of the Shema. We say it twice a day, once in the morning and once at night. The Almighty tells Moshe, Daber el b'nei Yisrael, speak to the children of Israel. They should put tzitzis on the corners of their garments, and on the tzitzis they should wrap a string of techelis, which is a special blue dyed wool. And that should be their tzitzis. And they should see it and remember all the mitzvahs of Hashem. And they should do them. They should perform the mitzvahs. And they should not deviate after their hearts or after their eyes. And they should remember and perform all the mitzvahs. And they shall be holy to Hashem their God. I am Hashem their God. I took you out of the land of Egypt to be for you as a God. Ani Hashem Elokechem. I am Hashem your God. Let's analyze this end of the Parsha. The commentaries all asked about the juxtaposition of the final components of the Parsha. Seems like maybe it's a bit of an inelegant segue. We have the various laws about sacrifices, the libations and the meal offerings, and we have the law of challah. You got to separate a bit of the dough for the kohen. And then we have the protocol of idolatry. The individual, the public, commit idolatry by mistake. And then we have the narrative of the person violating Shabbos being executed for it. And the final section about tzitzis. What's the connection? Like, what's the direction here that the Parsha is taking us on? So Rashi, at the end of the Parsha, he says something very interesting. The final 3 events, the final 3 sections in the Parsha, idolatry, and then the Mekoshesh, the person who was gathering twigs on Shabbos, and then the law of tzitzis, there is an internal consistency. Because all these 3 things, idolatry, and Mekoshesh, the person who violated the Shabbos, and the tzitzis, these are 3 examples of mitzvos that are equal to the rest of the Torah combined. Idolatry and the repudiation of idolatry, that's a mitzvah that we're told, is equal to all 613 put together. And Shabbos, that's another example of a mitzvah that's equal to the whole Torah. And then tzitzis, that's a third example. And thus there is a certain consistency between the 3 final sections of the Parsha. Now the truth is, there are 7 different mitzvos regarding which our sages tell us they are equal to all of Torah combined. My grandfather, a blessed memory, he wrote his final book that he wrote in his lifetime. It's a book called Mitzvos Hashkulos, which means the mitzvos that are equal. And it's all about these encapsulatory mitzvos, these 7 mitzvos that our sages tell us are equal to all of Torah put together, because these mitzvos, they encapsulate, each one in their own way, encapsulates the essence of the Torah. So this is a wonderful book. Maybe one day we'll do a podcast about it. Maybe, just maybe, I don't know. But this is a wonderful book that talks about these 7 mitzvos. And here at the end of the Parsha, we find 3 of them. One of them about repudiation of idolatry. You do that properly, that's the fulfillment of really the whole Torah on a certain level, a certain dimension. The Shabbos and the tzitzis. So that explains maybe a bit of the continuity in the end of the Parsha. But this year I saw an incredible midrash. A game-changing comment in the midrash. The midrash documents a conversation, a dialogue that happened between the Almighty and Moshe. The Jewish people, they're in the wilderness, and they find someone gathering twigs on Shabbos in flagrant violation of the laws of Shabbos. And the Almighty tells Moshe, or asks Moshe, why did this person violate the Shabbos? And Moshe responds, I don't know. So God says to him, I'll tell you why. I will tell you why this person violated the Shabbos. Because for 6 days, during the 6 days of the week, the nation has a prophylactic against sinning. Jewish people, for 6 days, they wear tefillin, phylacteries, on their head and on their arms. And they bind the wraps of the tefillin on their arms and on their head. And that serves as a constant reminder of their submission to the Almighty. But what happens? Shabbos comes around. And on Shabbos, you're not supposed to wear your tefillin. So on Shabbos, this person did not have a reminder to their allegiance, their affiliation with the Almighty. And that's what allowed them to sin. And therefore God says to Moshe, we have to give the nation a reminder that they fulfill even on Shabbos. Let's go find a mitzvah that will be fulfilled not just during the week, but also on Shabbos, and will serve as a reminder for those times where you're not wearing your tefillin. You'll have another mitzvah that will serve as an ever-present reminder of your relationship with the Almighty. And that's why, after the person violates the Shabbos, we have the mitzvah of tzitzis. Because tzitzis, unlike tefillin, you wear on Shabbos as well. You wear your talis, you wear your tzitzis on Shabbos. And what does it say about the mitzvah of tzitzis? You see them. And you remember the mitzvahs of the Almighty. And you remember your relationship with the Almighty. And you remember that He took us out of the land of Egypt. Ani Hashem Elokeichem. I am Hashem your God. That's the punchline of the tzitzis. And that's how we solve the problem. And we avoid a debacle, a disaster, like happened with the Makoshish, with the person gathering twigs on Shabbos. Now we'll have a reminder, even on Shabbos, and he won't, or no further person will violate the Shabbos. This is what the Midrash tells us. The reason for this sin, the Midrash says, was the absence of a permanent reminder of God. During the week, you have the tefillin, the phylacteries. And the phylacteries, they're a prophylactic against sin. How could you possibly sin? When you have this testament of God and it's wrapped to you, it's inconceivable. And that's what protected the people from sin during the week. But on Shabbos, there's no tefillin. So they're vulnerable. And that's why this person sinned. And hence, the immediate follow-up, the response to the twig gatherer, is the final part of the Parsha, the tzitzis. Now, there is some interesting symmetry between these two mitzvos. Just as the tefillin, we have the straps, and we wrap them around our arms, and we bind them to our head. Tzitzis, they also have knots The strings are knotted together, 5 knots in each one of the strings. And that too is about symbolizing this bond that we have forged with our Creator, and we must not reject it, and we must not violate it. And of course, this is a fascinating interpretation of the verse and the continuity between the episode of the twig gatherer and the final part of the Parsha and the tzitzis. But I think it's also a powerful lesson for us, just as a side note, about the power of tzitzis and of tefillin, of phylacteries, as prophylactics against sinning. I will tell you, if you want to read a very dramatic and quite unforgettable story in the Talmud, open up the book of Menachos on page 44a and read about how tzitzis spared a person from a terrible sin in very dramatic and memorable fashion. But this is a fascinating idea. After this disaster, this catastrophe of the person who violated the Shabbos, we're told the way to avoid it. And throughout the week we have the tefillin. Shabbos we don't have a tefillin, so we are given another mitzvah that will serve a similar purpose. We're given the mitzvah of the tzitzis. Now here's where it gets interesting. Who is this Mekoshesh? Who is this person who violates the Shabbos in our Parsha and is executed for it? So the Torah is moot on that question. The Torah doesn't tell us really anything. But the Talmud doxes him. That's a modern term. To dox someone. To reveal their identity. Talmud says that Rabbi Akiva revealed the identity of the twig gatherer. His name is Tzlafchad. Tzlafchad. Now Tzlafchad, that name appears in the Torah. At the end of the book of Numbers, we have a story where there are 5 women, all daughters of a man named Tzlafchad, who died in the wilderness. He died because of his sins in the wilderness. And they're trying to claim their father's ancestral lands. He has no sons. He has just daughters. What happens? The father dies, leaves no sons. Who inherits the ancestral lands? And the 5 daughters of Tzlafchad come to Moshe, and ultimately it's determined, the Almighty tells Moshe that in the event that a man has no sons, his ancestral lands go to his daughters. And the subjects of that interaction are the daughters of Tzlafchad. And Rabbi Akiva reveals to us in the Talmud, and he proves it from Scripture, that this Mekoshesh, the person who's gathering twigs on Shabbos, he is none other than Tzlafchad. Okay, that's interesting. But there's more. The Midrash tells us that this Mekoshesh, this Tzlafchad, this person who's gathering twigs on Shabbos, he was righteous, and he actually had noble intentions when he violated the Shabbos. What happened in the beginning of our Parsha? Jewish people were about to enter the land, and they just did some due diligence. They sent in some spies just to find out where the vulnerabilities are, to where the defenses are. Some scouts to go examine the enemy fortifications. And they come back with a bad story, and unfortunately it cascades, it elevates, it exacerbates, and before you know it, there's this decree. The nation's going to spend 40 years in the wilderness. They're like on the doorstep of entering the land, and suddenly they're told you'll enter in 40 years from now. So the people were dejected, and they felt that the Almighty was unfair. We have a deal here. You take us all out of Egypt. We accept the Torah, and we enter the land. And the Almighty, he rejected his part of the deal, they argued. If we're not going to enter the land, they reasoned, we're no longer obligated by our terms, by our side of the bargain, that we're going to observe his Torah. So there was an attitude that was prevalent in the wilderness following the events of the beginning of our Parsha, there was an attitude of maybe we no longer are obligated by the mitzvos, they're no longer binding. So in order to quell this opinion, in order to dispel this mistaken notion, this righteous man, name is Slavchad, he gathers some witnesses and he says, look carefully what I'm about to do. And he willfully violates the Shabbos. And they warn him, don't do it. And he says, I don't care. I'm going to violate the Shabbos and I want to be executed. And I'm going to make sure I check all the boxes that are needed for capital crime. The witnesses, they warn him. He verbally accepts the warning. I know that I'm doing a violation of Shabbos and I know that I'm going to execute it and I'm doing it nonetheless. And indeed, they bring him to court and he gets executed. What happens to the rest of the nation? Everyone realizes, oh, you better believe that the laws of the Torah are completely binding still. And this martyrdom almost of this Slavchad, it created a chilling effect on the rumblings that were in the camp. Oh, the Torah is no longer valid. It's obsolete. No longer can anyone claim that the Torah has reached the point of obsolescence. They witnessed everything. Everyone sees Slavchad. He's been executed because he gathered twigs on Shabbos. The laws of Shabbos, the laws of the Torah are still very much in effect. So we have this interesting backstory here. We have this, can we call him a righteous person? It's hard to know because he's righteous. He had noble intentions, but he also violated the Shabbos. And he died in order to reinforce the sanctity and the immutability of the Torah and of Shabbos. And then at the end of the book, his daughters are going to make some very consequential appearances, and they're going to be the ones who teach us or who are used as the vehicles to teach us an important law about the inheritance of ancestral lands. Now we find out even more about this Slavchad character. Now listen, this year, year 8, the Parsha podcast is going to be deep and deeper. So you have to forgive me if this goes in a little bit of an unusual and surprising way. The Kabbalists tell us that this person, Slavchad, he makes another appearance. He is going to be reincarnated as a very righteous person. And he's going to be given the opportunity to fix what he corrupted by violating the Shabbos. Yes, he had noble intentions. Noble intentions are great, but he violated the Shabbos. He's going to be brought back, reincarnated, and be put in a situation where he has to choose whether or not to violate the Shabbos. And he's going to overcome it and thus rectify and cleanse and fix and purge the flaw in his soul that came with the violation of Shabbos. We're told by the Kabbalists that the Tana, the author of the Mishnah, whose name was Rabbi Yehuda Bar Ilai, according to most, when it says the word Rabbi Yehuda in the Mishnah, it's a reference to this Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Judah. This person, it's the same person, it's a reincarnation of Slavchad. It is perhaps not a coincidence. Slavchad ben Chefer, which is the full name of Slavchad, it's the exact gematria of Rabbi Yehuda Bar Ilai. Rabbi Yehuda, the son of Ilai. So that's maybe some indication that maybe there's some overlap. But the Talmud gives us an amazing story, which tells about this great rabbi and his superlative care to not violate the Shabbos. And it gives us this incredible wink, wink, and a nod that this is none other than Slavchad. It tells the story that Rabbi Yehuda Bar Ilai, there was a breach in his fence around his field. So he wanted to come and fix the fence. There's a hole in the fence. Got to fix it. And he remembered that it was Shabbos. Of course, you can't build a fence on Shabbos. So not only did he refrain from fixing the fence on Shabbos, he never fixed that breach in his wall, to never forget about the Shabbos. Continues the Talmud that there was a miracle that happened. And a caper bush grew in the breach, so closed up the breach. It was wall on one side and wall on the other side, and this big bush in between, covering up, sealing up the wall. And that bush produced food for him, livelihood for him, and for the rest of his household. This is a story about Rabbi Yehuda bar Ilai. And here's where it gets interesting. This caper bush, the word that the Talmud uses for it is a tzluf. That's the name of that's the name of the bush. And the commentaries tell us, the Kabbalists, they're citing the Arizal amongst others, how would you say one caper bush? You would say tzlaf chad. One, chad is one in Aramaic. Tzlaf is this type of bush. So he had one caper bush, tzlaf chad, that closed up, that sealed this breach in the wall. So that's the wink wink, that he was extra careful, extra scrupulous in the laws of Shabbos in his second go-round. And he permanently refrained from fixing the breach in the wall. And then the Kabbalists add that this was his livelihood. Talmud says this is his livelihood, meaning in the eyes of the Talmud, it's not just like, oh, this is how he made money. This is what he paid taxes. This was his W-2. It's not what it's saying. It's saying that his spiritual livelihood was from this act. Because we're all here with a requirement to do something. We're all here on a mission. We're all here to upgrade our soul in some way or another, to fix what we need to fix. And that's our livelihood. And the soul of Tzlavchad, the soul of Rabbi Yehuda bar Ilai, it needed to elevate the Shabbos. And by doing this, he elevated the Shabbos. And therefore this act was his spiritual livelihood from then on out. And then there's another story. Again, Rabbi Yehuda bar Ilai, this is in Shabbos 25b. It describes his meticulous reverence for the Shabbos. He had a policy for how he would prepare. This was his custom for how he prepared for the Shabbos. Before Shabbos, it was Erev Shabbos, Shabbos Eve. He had this bowl full of hot water, and he'd wash his face, and wash his hands, and wash his feet. And he'd wrap himself up in tzitzis. And he would sit and wait in anticipation for the Shabbos. This is a description of someone who has this superlative honoring of Shabbos and reverence for Shabbos. But I find it fascinating. The Talmud spells out that he sat in tzitzis. And again, we see this juxtaposition of the Parshios. Tzitzis, that is told us in our Parsha, in the aftermath of the sin of Tzlavchad, the aftermath of the sin of the person who's gathering twigs. And this is a way, the tzitzis is a way to rectify the sin that happened. And it's no coincidence, perhaps, that this person in his second go-round, when he prepares for Shabbos, he's going to don the special garments, the special tzitzis, in preparation for Shabbos, and thereby fulfilling what he needed to do in his second lifetime and rectifying the sin that's featured in our Parsha. Yes, it was done with noble intentions, but it was a sin nonetheless, and he got a second opportunity, a second crack at it, and he rectified and atoned for what he had broken. And I think it's a heartwarming story to see that he was able to repent and actualize his intentions. He wanted to stand up for the honor of Shabbos, and he managed to do that and to rectify in the second go-round. But I want to just I want to stress, if you look at the beginning of this narrative in our Parsha, chapter 15, verse 32, the verse says, Jewish people were in the wilderness and they found a man who was gathering twigs on Shabbos. And Rashi in his commentary, he says that this is a disgrace for the Jewish people because they only observed the first Shabbos in the wilderness, and in the second Shabbos in the wilderness, this person came and violated the Shabbos. And there's a bit of a frightening observation. Jewish people kept the first Shabbos in the wilderness. When it came to the second Shabbos in the wilderness, that's when the event of the Mekoshesh, the person that we know as Slavchad, who came later on as Rabbi Yehuda Bar Ilai in the times of the Mishnah, about 2,000 years ago. And that's when he came and violated the Shabbos. And of course, he had his noble intentions. And this was almost like a martyrdom. He wanted to die in order to dispel any misconceptions about the laws of Shabbos and the laws of the Torah more broadly not being applicable. So we may look at him as a hero, perhaps hard to say he's a hero of the Shabbos, but he's a martyr of sorts. Rashi tells us that the first Shabbos in the wilderness, it was observed properly. This person, Slavchad, the Mekoshesh, the person who's gathering twigs on Shabbos, he violated the second Shabbos in the wilderness. And the frightening observation is that the Talmud tells us that if the Jewish people, if we only observed 2 Shabboses in a row and we followed all the laws, that's all it takes to ensure that we have redemption. We arrive at what we call Messiah. What does it take? The whole nation observing 2 Shabboses consecutively. That's all it takes. And here Rashi tells us that as a result of this Slavchad, of this person's violation of the Shabbos, they only kept 1 Shabbos in the wilderness, not the second. It's implied from this that had Slavchad, or whatever you want to call him, the person who violated the Shabbos, had he not done it, the nation would have secured 2 weeks in a row with no violation of the Shabbos, and they would have transitioned to the next epoch of history. They would have arrived at the universe of Messiah of redemption, and all of our nation's sufferings for the last 3,300 or so years, it all could have been avoided. And yes, he had noble intentions, but think about what he wrought with this noble intentions. Everyone knows what they say about noble intentions, right? We have to heed and hearken to the Almighty and not be too clever or too cute like he was, because after all, if he had just avoided doing what he did, and yes, he has calculations, but those were his calculations. That was not the will of the Almighty. And that is a terrible shame and very unfortunate. Of course, it's a lesson for us. Sometimes we have all these clever ideas and clever notions and creative reasons why we should do something which is in violation of the will of Hashem, and that's not what we're supposed to do. Listen, he's a special person. He's righteous. He has a legacy in the Torah, and certainly once you open up the Kabbalistic literature, you find very nice things about him. He is righteous, and he was noble, and his intentions were completely pure. But still, he violated the Shabbos, and that is unconscionable. Let's get to segment number 3. We have tzitzis. I'm sitting here in the Torch Center, and I have a custom to wear my tzitzis outside. I'm holding them in my hands. And my tzitzis, I could see them whenever I look down, I could see them dangling, these fringes. And I'm fortunate enough to also have the tchelas as well. I got the white strings, and I got the blue strings as well, in fulfillment of this mitzvah. Some people today who only wear white strings because they're not convinced that the blue strings are either real. There's a whole story behind it. Most of y'all know the story. It was rediscovered, and some people have some quibbles with it. But this is a mitzvah that we read about every day, multiple times. It's in our Parsha. We have tzitzis. What a beautiful mitzvah. And now we also learned how tzitzis is a prophylactic against sinning. It's like the tefillin that we wear all the time. It used to be people wore tefillin all day. Now most people wear tefillin just in the morning, just by the morning prayers. You wear tzitzis the whole day, even sometimes into the night, even though it's not obligatory to wear tzitzis at night. We have this incredible opportunity, this incredible force to remember the Almighty at all times. We got the white streams and we have the blue streams. And the commentaries tell us that the special blue string, the tcheles string, it's full of all sorts of insights and meaning and lessons and symbolism. For example, we like to cite the Sefer HaChinuch, which is a book that goes through the 613 mitzvos in the order in which they appear in the Torah. And he says something very beautiful about the tzitzis. We have the white strings, and that is symbolic of the body. And we have the blue strings, the tcheles strings, and that symbolizes the soul. Because the blue, the Talmud tells us, it's the color of the sea, and the sea is the color of the heavens, and the heavens remind us of the holiest parts of the heavens, and that's where our soul comes from. And thus, we have this duality on our tzitzis, on the strings. We've got the white strings, that's the body, and wrapped around them is the blue strings. And that's to remind us that we have to make sure that we bind and tie the blue strings on top of the white ones, because we have the body and the soul, and those two are competing for primacy within a person. And we take the blue strings and we wrap them around the white strings to indicate that the soul, which is symbolized by the blue strings, it is superior and it is dominant. That's one idea. But the Talmud that he cites, it's a very fascinating teaching in the Talmud. The Book of Sota, on page 17a, why do we have this special color on our tzitzis? Why do we have this tcheles, this blue string on our tzitzis? Why are some of the strings dyed blue? So the Talmud tells us, because this color is similar to the sea, and the sea is similar to the heaven, the firmament. And the heavens, well, that's similar, on some level, to the throne of God. And that's when you see the tzitzis. The verse tells us, you see it. You're supposed to remember God. How do you remember God? Well, you see the blue string. And blue, well, what else is blue? The ocean is blue. Oh, the ocean's blue. Well, what else is similar to the ocean? What's the heavens? The heavens, they're blue. Oh, I'm thinking about the heavens. I'm going to think about the heavenly throne. And that's how I remember God. That's what the Talmud tells us. And the commentaries all puzzle over this. It seems like there's a bit of a circuitous route. The blue string doesn't remind you of God, but it reminds you of the sea. And when you think of the sea, maybe remember the heaven. And you think of the heaven, that's maybe a good time to think about the throne of God. The Midrash has an even more elaborate journey. It says that the tcheles, it reminds you of weeds, which reminds you of the sea, which reminds you of the heaven, or the firmament, and that reminds you of rainbows, that reminds you of the clouds, that reminds you of the throne, and finally, it reminds you of the honor of God. Again, it's a very unusual story, a multi-stationed elevation, so to speak, from us getting, looking at our tzitzis, looking at the tcheles, the blue string in our tzitzis, and remembering God. So one idea that the commentaries tell us is that the Talmud does not advise us to say, oh, look at your blue string and remember God. That's not what it says. Because you don't just leap from your tzitzis, from your tcheles, the blue string in the tzitzis, you don't just leap directly to God. You have to do things in a proper order. We think of our ascent, our spiritual ascent like that of ascending a ladder. Jacob has the dream and he sees the angels ascending the ladder and descending the ladder. That is emblematic of how we're supposed to ascend our way to heaven. You go one step at a time, one rung at a time. So you don't just leap directly from the tcheles to God. You can take one step up, one step up, one step up, and eventually you'll arrive at the zenith. I want to expand on this idea. I've been asked a few times in my career as a rabbi. You get all sorts of questions. Of course, you can email me, rabbi@warbijim.com, if you have a question that you'd like to pose. One of the questions that I get is, how do you make the tchelas? How do you make the blue dye that we use to make the blue streams in our tzitzis? You take a chilazon. A chilazon is a type of animal. It's a shelled animal. It's a mollusk. It's a snail. And you break it open and you take the special membrane and use that to make the dye via the chemical process. But this animal is a non-kosher animal. So I've received this question a few times. It's a sharp question. Why does the Almighty tell us to take a non-kosher animal to use to make the tchelas? Make the tchelas, which is part of our tzitzis. In the temple, of course, we remember the tabernacle, the temple. Parts of the temple were made out of tchelas wool. Part of the vestments of the high priest were made out of this tchelas wool. Use a non-kosher animal? It seems so strange. And whenever I get this question, I never really had a good answer. So, they teach you in rabbi school, find a way to deflect it. You have to learn how to dodge tough questions. You redirect it. You make a distraction. Oh, look, squirrel. But really, it's a good question. There's so many lessons we read about the tchelas. And where does it come from? Its origins are in a non-kosher animal. So I have a suggestion here. Tzitzis. It's one of the mitzvahs that are equal to the whole Torah combined. So if we just look at this mitzvah, we're able to know something that is applicable across the board. Tzitzis is symbolic of the whole Torah. We see the tzitzis, we remember God and all the mitzvos of God. So it's an idea. I wrote about it in my book. I'm sure all of y'all have read my book already. I'm sure. So this is just a review. The Midrash tells us that the tzitzis are supposed to remind us of God, but really of the objective of all of Torah and mitzvos. And it gives us a parable, a story. There was a sailor who was on the ship, and he got thrown into the water. And there was a raging storm, and he was going to drown. And the captain of the ship took a lifeline and threw the string to the flailing sailor down below. And the sailor holds on to the string, and the captain tells the sailor, don't let go of the string. If you let go, you're going to be lost forever. But if you hold on to it tight, I will pull you up back to the safety and the security of the ship deck. Now in this analogy, the captain is God, and the sailor is the soul, and the water, the raging waters that are threatening to engulf the soul, well, that's this world. That's the body. The soul is so pure, it's so elevated, so precious, so holy, but it's thrown into a world, into a body that can jeopardize it, that can threaten its well-being, that can imperil it. How does the soul ensure it will survive? How does the soul ensure that it will return to its origin safely to join the captain on the ship deck? The way it does it is via the lifeline, via the string, via the mitzvos. The string, the tzitzis. It's symbolic of the role of all the mitzvos. What's the goal of mitzvos? To pull the soul away from danger and towards the safety and to the security of the ship deck, of proximity with God. That's the tzitzis. It's this path of ascension away from the danger, from the worst depths to the absolute greatest heights. Where does it start? Where does this journey start? The sailor is overboard and is drowning and will die. It will die. The sailor is being consumed by the water. The soul is being swallowed up by all the forces that want to destroy it. And at that point, grabbing onto the tzitzis can provide salvation. Perhaps we can suggest the tzitzis, that's the string. But part of this package is the blue, the tcheles. And where does that come from? It comes from a non-kosher animal. And just as tzitzis symbolizes this idea of being pulled up to God, tcheles is another version of that. It's the blue, which reminds us of the sea, which reminds us of the heaven, which reminds us of the throne of glory. The same idea, starting from down below and ascending all the way up to the Almighty. And it's made from something non-kosher. And the lesson is, even if something is so corrupt, so seemingly unsalvageable, so impure, so non-kosher, that's the starting point. Tzitzis still applies to that person, to that thing. They're still away from that, for that situation to go all the way back to God. The starting point does not have to be kosher. The starting point could be non-kosher. And it's still possible for this process, for this salvation of the tzitzis, of the mitzvos, to restore the soul back to its safety, to its security, to its proximity to the captain on the ship deck. Tcheles to be the beginning of the journey. And it can start in the absolute pits. Notwithstanding its non-kosher origin, it can ascend to close proximity to God. Now we had mentioned that the tcheles wool is used in the tabernacle. And it's also used in the garments and the vestments of the Kohen Gadol, of the high priest. There was one of the vestments of the high priest that was made exclusively of this material, of this blue wool, blue dyed wool dyed with tcheles. And that is the me'il. The me'il is one of the garments, one of the 8 garments of the high priest. It's the robe. And it's an all blue wool robe. On the bottom, it had golden bells with ringers inside them, alongside pomegranates made out of wool. And they were side by side, and whenever the high priest walked, they banged into each other and it made a ringing sound. That's the me'il, that's the robe made out of this material. Now the Talmud tells us that each one of the vestments of the garments of the high priest, it would provide atonement for a different class of sins. And it tells us that the me'il, this garment, the robe made exclusively of this material, this wool, this tcheles wool, this blue wool material with the chattering bells and ringers on the bottom, that provided atonement for the sin of lashon hara, for the sin of gossip. And the Talmud tells us, the me'il, the robe, made a lot of noise. There was a cacophonous sound that emerged from it. And therefore it made sense. Noise should fix noise. When someone sins lashon hara, they gossip, they speak negatively about someone else. That's sound, that's voices, that's noise. Okay, the me'il makes noise, and therefore that provides atonement for that particular sin. Perhaps we can speculate. There's maybe another insight into the robes, to the me'il's power to atone for lashon hara. What is the cause of lashon hara? Why would someone speak negatively, would speak evil about another person? The sin of lashon hara, the sin of gossip, is to focus on someone's flaws. You find someone, they have bad character, they're a sketchy person, they have flaws, and you share that. And you almost assign that person that negative character trait. The me'il, the robe, is made out of tcheles. It's made of this blue dye that originates in a non-kosher animal. This material, the blue dyed wool, it reminds us that even the lowest of the low, someone who is almost completely submerged in that roaring sea, someone who begins with the lowest point, the non-kosher origin, they can ascend to the highest of highs. Perhaps this is another reason why the me'il specifically, this garment made exclusively out of chelas, that's why it can atone for the sin of Lashon Hara, because on a fundamental level, you think about it, this perspective of the chelas, that no matter how low someone is, they can always ascend all the way back to God. That remedies the cause of Lashon Hara. That attitude remedies the causes of Lashon Hara and thus provides atonement for it. I appreciate deeply your attention to this week's Parsha podcast. Again, I'm sitting by myself in the Torch Center here in Houston, Texas, but I know that you're listening and I appreciate that you listened all the way to the end. I always say that most people, they stop listening halfway through, but then I get angry emails, rabbi.com. No, I listened all the way to the end. That's my point. You listened to the end, but maybe someone else didn't. But I know if you're listening right now, you definitely listened all the way to the end, and I appreciate that. Thank you for your attention and for your listenership and for your wonderful support of the Parsha podcast and the great work of Torch. Send me an email, rabbi.com. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Have an elevating and inspiring and productive rest of your week. And have a sensational, uplifting, powerful, and invigorating Shabbos upcoming. And please God, with the unending help of the Almighty, we will gather together again next week for another installment of the Parsha podcast. And again, my email address is rabbiwolbe@gmail.com.